The next period of Indian history that we're going to take a look at is the Gupta period, extending from 320 AD to about the middle of the 6th century AD. So please take note that we are moving forward several centuries in time. We left off around 350 BC, and now we're picking up in 320 AD. All right, so please do keep that in mind. The Gupta Empire, the Gupta period, is very important. It's considered the classical period in Indian history, a high point of Indian civilization and culture, literature and the arts, political stability, economic well-being, and so forth. As you can see, the power base of the Guptas was in the north, in the dark blue there, around Pataliputra, the capital of their empire. In a general sense, the Gupta Empire followed a model of decentralized power. That's a key feature of political and social and even economic organization of this period. And under the Guptas, the Hindu, Buddhist, Jain civilization of the subcontinent reached new heights. And the culture of this period was necessarily religiously diverse and pluralistic, and the Gupta monarchs embraced that. And so we're going to focus on a few different key components of the Gupta period. Again, the classical Indian period. We're going to talk a bit about some of the important Gupta monarchs, how they approached governance, their contributions to Indian history, and so forth. And then we're going to talk about important developments in the religious and the social sphere, especially pertaining to Buddhism and to Hinduism. Some of the developments we're going to talk about in this lecture pertaining to these two religions, pertaining to Buddhism and Hinduism, they predate our period a little bit, but they're longer-term changes, and so we're going to talk about them here in this context. And we're going to talk about some changes to the caste system as well, which occurred during this period. All right, well, let's get started then. So the founder of the dynasty was a man named Chandragupta, who reigned from 320 to 335. He is really the one who took the small principality that he governed over in the Ganges and turned it into an imperial state, extending westward, extending to the south, extending to the east, and he's the one who laid the groundwork for the Gupta Empire and for classical India. And his successors solidified his gains. So the so-called imperial Guptas, Samudragupta and Chandragupta, ruled from 335 all the way until 415. So a tremendously long period of time during which India experienced a great deal of political stability and political unity over much, although as you can see on this map, not all, of the Indian subcontinent. Samudragupta extended the territory of the Gupta Empire along the eastern coast of India and a bit further onto the Deccan Plateau. Inscriptions record his successful conquests and the subjugation of numerous kings, and sometimes record his generosity toward them. In addition to his military skills and political savvy, he was also a skilled poet and musician, and was honored formally as a poet king, a Kaviraja. He gathered about his court many intellectuals because this suited his tastes. He was a big supporter and promoter of Indian culture at this time. And one reason that this is the classical period in Indian history is because of royal support, and beyond royal support, elite support of culture, music and the arts, poets and authors, and so forth. Although he was a Hindu himself, he was tolerant and supportive of Buddhism and employed many Buddhists as advisors and funded Buddhist temples and so forth. Part of the tolerant, pluralistic approach taken by the Gupta monarchs of this period. Chandragupta, who ruled from 375 to 415, expanded Gupta domains to the west, which gave the Guptas direct access to key western trading ports and the revenues which came along with them. And you can see those territories in what's Gujarat today in the lighter blue on the map. As a result of his conquests and his political and military success, he was honored with the title Son of Valor. That is, sun as in the disk in the sky, or a Vikramaditya, a highly esteemed title in Brahmanic India. He too was a supporter of culture at his courts, and he in fact maintained 3 of them at Pataliputra, Ayodhya, and Ujjain. He kept a circle of poets at his court known as the 9 Gems, and again, Indian classical culture, very intimately connected to royal and elite support at this time. The Guptas relied upon Brahmanic notions of kingship entirely, as the title, as I noted just now, should make clear. The king's right to rule was divinely ordained and sanctified by the ceremonies that the Brahmins performed on their behalf. Beyond this, they followed the policy of Raja Dharma, the duty of kings to protect their subjects and to arbitrate in disputes. Theirs, as I mentioned earlier, was a decentralized empire as well, centered on the concept of Samanta, which in the Gupta period came to mean a neighboring subsidiary ruler who was a tributary of the Gupta sovereign. The word has necessarily undergone much change since then and over time. But in the Gupta period, that is what it meant. Again, a neighboring subsidiary ruler who was a tributary of the Gupta monarch. The Allahabad inscription gives us an indication of how the Gupta monarchs approached this decentralized system, this system of Samanta. This inscription relates to Samudragupta, who's generally considered to have really established it. And after defeating a few of the monarchs in this region, allowed them to retain their local positions, but within a new Gupta hierarchy as friendly tributaries. These rulers, thus, thereafter, benefited from Gupta protection, and the Guptas acquired a portion of their wealth as tribute and taxation revenue. These rulers were given significant scope to deal with governance in their region and held grants of land as well, bestowed directly by the Gupta monarchs. These secular land grants were given not only to defeated monarchs placed within the new hierarchical system of Samanta under the Gupta monarchs, but also to crown officers, military commanders, and even sometimes craft guilds, all in exchange for service and loyalty to the state. If it is helpful, you can think of it as a form of Indian feudalism. These lands were granted on a more or less permanent basis and came with complete control over the resources of the land, including a labor supply, and the rights were hereditary. The monarchs, for their part, expected remission of taxes, remission of tribute to the central authorities, loyalty, service in the military, and other functions and services as necessary. Again, try to think of it as a form of Indian feudalism. But legal control over the common population was ceded to the grantee almost entirely. Thus, the Gupta period created a class of feudal intermediaries throughout the countryside. This system worked quite well as long as the Gupta monarch was strong and capable, but, like any decentralized system, could prove problematic in other contexts and circumstances. It is important within the bigger picture and the longer term because this is how India will be organized, roughly speaking, into the modern period, even into the 20th century, into the British period, in a very decentralized fashion. Even, one could argue, today the modern state is organized in a very decentralized fashion. Though it is not a feudal fashion, it nevertheless grants a wide degree of latitude to the individual Indian states as they exist today since independence in 1947. But prior to independence, these regionalized, feudal, hierarchical relationships and arrangements were remarkably common, whether we are talking about the Gupta period or the politically fragmented period which came thereafter, or the period of Muslim dominance, beginning with the Delhi Sultanate and followed by the Mughals and then the British thereafter. So it is an important development in Indian history, very important. The central government, beyond the monarch, beyond the king, contained a sort of council of ministers led by a chief minister, who was the head of the central civilian administration. And there were others attached to various military functions and so forth, including a minister of the Elephant Corps, but we don't need to get into details about that here. At its apogee, here in 450 AD, you can see the extent of the Gupta Empire. You can see the core Gupta region in purple, centered in the Ganges River basin, and you can see the Gupta capitals here. You can see Pataliputra, the most important of the capitals, right? Nayodha and Ujjain as well on this map. And you can see there in blue the kingdom of the Vakatakas on the Deccan Plateau, which was incorporated, basically, into the Gupta sphere through a marital alliance. So again, this is the Gupta Empire at its height. At its height. You can see that the southernmost portions of India were not a part of the empire. And indeed, there is a common dynamic throughout Indian history, rooted in the geography of the place, this north-south divide. The north of the subcontinent, structured by these massive rivers, the Indus and the Ganges, and divided from the south by the imposing plateau, the Deccan Plateau, and other environmental features, geographical features. But all good things must come to an end, and so too the Gupta Empire. And a variety of factors contributed to the collapse of Gupta authority across northern India. Key actors in all of this were the so-called White Huns, which you can see. You can see their sort of territorial extent in the map on the left, the Empire of the Huns there. They were a branch of a larger Hunnic tribal group from Central Asia, and they began raiding into India in the middle of the 5th century. At that time, at the height of the Guptas, powerful Gupta monarchs and the powerful Gupta military stopped them and gave India a period of respite from the Huns lasting several decades. But the Huns came back. And when they did, they were more successful, eventually conquering territory in the Punjab and in the western Ganges, and cutting the Guptas off from their lucrative western trade ports, which you can see here again on the map on the left as they reached the coast there These military defeats in turn had an effect upon the degree of loyalty offered to the Gupta monarchs by the tributary rulers of the regions of the Gupta Empire, who, it seems, sensed a degree of weakness in the Gupta system and the Gupta monarchs and openings to assert their independence and their authority. We can also imagine, in this context, the need for localized action in an insecure environment. Anyway, all of this would have encouraged the breaking apart of centralized authority, the pulling away of these regions which were tied to the central government through Samanta. And that is precisely what happens over time. By about 500 AD, you have these formally subsidiary, tributary rulers basically declaring independence and going their own way. And so that by the mid 6th century AD, the map on the right, you can see India is fractured and the unity of the Gupta period is over, the Gupta Empire is over, and you just have this rump Gupta state centered around Pataliputra, which you see on the map in purple on the right there. And that is the end of Indian unity for roughly, let's see here, until the Delhi Sultanate, so roughly 800 years, which is rather remarkable, but that's the political trajectory India will take after the Gupta period. So major changes introduced at this time in the mid 6th century. Okay, so on to developments in the religious sphere, and we're going to start with Buddhism here. Buddhism. So let us begin by tracing the history of Buddhism from about 350 BC to the Gupta period, briefly. It was a time of Buddhist expansion in the subcontinent. It was a time of royal patronage for Buddhism, especially by the monarch Ashoka the Great, as well as some Kushan kings. It was a time period when Buddhism was exported out of India for the first time. And this is a subject we will study directly in our next unit of study, China. And so it was an important period in the history of Buddhism. By the time the Guptas take the throne, Buddhism is firmly established throughout the whole of the subcontinent, throughout all of India. However, beginning sometime around late 1st century BC, early 1st century AD, you can't really pinpoint it precisely, Buddhism starts to evolve in pretty significant and meaningful ways. And what we have with certainty over the first couple centuries AD and into the Gupta period is the emergence of a Buddhism that we call Mahayana Buddhism. The evolution of Buddhism away from its original teaching as put forward in the Buddhist Dharma promulgated by the Buddha himself, centered on the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, and toward ideas and concepts rooted more firmly in the religious sphere. And what was fundamentally involved in this transformation from the Buddhism of the Buddha himself to Mahayana Buddhism is the change in the status of the Buddha himself from a remote sage, a philosophical figure, if you will, and Buddhism as necessarily a way of life, to depicting and understanding the Buddha as a god and worshiping him as such. Now, by the early centuries AD, Buddhism, ideologically speaking, had come to be centered around the so-called three jewels. These are the lessons learned from the life of the Buddha, the so-called Dhamma, the law of the mind, the good life and the spiritual path, and the rather strict life of the monastic Sangha. But some within the Buddhist community this time began to question whether the three jewels was too narrow a framework for newer devotees approaching the faith, too restrictive, too intellectual. They argued that the Buddha could only truly come to life for the masses if he were a deity, if he were elevated to the status of a god, though these people did not outright reject the three jewels by any means. And thus a doctrine of the Buddha as a god and a doctrine of salvation by faith were promulgated, and these stood at complete variance with traditional teachings, as the Buddha himself never claimed divine status and had rooted his quest for enlightenment in each individual's rational understanding of his ideas and methods, again, as expounded in the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. But these Buddhist dissenters, they argued for more. They argued that divine intercessors were necessary to help individuals achieve enlightenment. And thus, the Bodhisattvas came into existence. These were individuals who had done what was necessary to achieve enlightenment, but had abandoned it, or delayed it, or renounced it to help humanity achieve certain goals. They varied depending on the bodhisattva we're talking about. And thus there were terrestrial bodhisattvas, born again and again, to help toward these ends. But there are also celestial bodhisattvas, who, technically speaking, could achieve enlightenment, right, at any point, should they so wish, but again, delayed it for other purposes, to help humanity achieve certain ends. And again, these bodhisattvas became intercessors. They became individuals who were approached, effectively speaking, as deities themselves, not necessarily the Buddha or other Buddhas, but as bodhisattvas. Perhaps if it is helpful, you can think of them, the conceptual apparatus is different, but you can think of them as Christian saints, something like that. Again, intercessors, right? Intercessors, that's the idea. And fundamentally what they tell us is that the Buddhists who are changing Buddhism into Mahayana Buddhism are recognizing the need to have a broader pantheon. They're recognizing the need to incorporate various gods and goddesses held near and dear by the mass of the population into the Buddhist pantheon itself, right? It's an attempt to be more syncretistic, more flexible, more malleable. And it's successful. It's successful. We can see this new type of Buddhism in some of the texts of the period just before the Gupta period and during the Gupta period. For example, in the Milinda Panha, in which the Indian Greek king Menander asks questions to a Buddhist philosopher who lays stress throughout on the Buddha's divinity and the importance of relic worship, that is, relics of the Buddha. The Mahavastu, which lays out the materials, methods, and modes of Buddha worship. That is how one was to approach worshiping the Buddha, the deity. Or the Lotus Sutra, likely the most important text, in which the concept of the bodhisattvas is laid out and formulated. This text also includes precise rules for the design of stupas and guidelines for the ritual worship of the Buddha himself. All of these are composite texts. They're added to significantly over time. But again, they seem to begin their lives around the end of the 1st century BC, but definitely the first couple centuries AD. Sanskrit was the main language used, though some exist in Pali as well. All of this provoked something of a split within Buddhism. The new religion fashioned out of these changes and reforms again came to be called Mahayana Buddhism, which means greater vehicle. And then those who tended to disagree with some of this became the Theravadin crowd. And this is a simplification, but they tended to stick with older, more rigid formulations of the religion. Though over time, Theravadin Buddhism will, of course, evolve itself. But this is not a subject that we're going to focus upon or study in this class. But Theravadin Buddhism will end up taking root in Sri Lanka, Thailand, Southeast Asia, for the most part. And again, to emphasize the point, throughout the Gupta period, the Gupta monarchs governed in a pluralistic fashion. They supported Buddhism in its emerging Mahayana form with significant financial resources. And this undoubtedly contributed to the success of the Buddhist reformers, at least on some level, you can imagine. All right, so that is one major development of the period. And again, these developments predate the Gupta period by a couple of centuries. These are longer-term developments. The first manifestations of what we might call popular Hinduism also emerge at this time. And the chronology is kind of similar, right? What I'm about to describe really begins in earnest in the first couple centuries AD and extends into the Gupta period. Vedic Brahmanism, which we discussed in the previous lecture, again, had been the principal religion of India from the 6th century BC, when those dissident Brahmins started to critique and reform the Vedic religion. And the main elements of this religion were the supremacy of the Vedas, first and foremost. Second, the caste system. Third, sacrificial rituals for propitiating powerful Vedic elemental gods. And the monopolistic role of Brahmin priests in presiding over all religious functions and ceremonies. Two strong theistic traditions blossomed at this time and began to modify Vedic Brahmanism: Vaishnavism and Shivism. They centered around three concepts. First, that of a supreme deity in the form of Vishnu or Shiva. Vishnu was originally a Vedic god of lesser importance. Second, that of salvation being made possible through the grace of this deity. And third, the idea of salvation, third, the attainment of salvation through intense love and devotion to this deity, a process known, or a practice known as bhakti, which typically involved an image or an idol of the god, singing a hymn to this god, visiting a shrine to this god, or conducting the religious ceremony within one's home. These two devotional traditions did not break away completely from Vedic Brahmanism, but instead rejected or modified certain aspects of it, especially the role of sacrifice, which was first modified and reformed and then over time rejected entirely within emerging, evolving, devotional Hinduism, which is what we have here. A more personal religious experience, divorced from full Brahmanic control, but nevertheless existing within the Brahmanic umbrella. It was more accessible and flexible. This devotional form of worship necessarily appealed to the masses, who were drawn to its forms of worship and more direct access to the divine. It is in this context that the Puranas were written during the Gupta age, or perhaps we might say finalized during the Gupta age, and they continue to be modified thereafter. They served as a sort of religious primer for the masses, written as they were, in an accessible style and language, and containing a mix of morality, history, genealogy, folklore, practical wisdom, astrology, geography, medicine, and so on. One of the key ways the theists drew the masses to their devotional form of worship, and actually away from Buddhism and orthodox, what we might call orthodox Vedic Brahmanism. They are excellent texts through which to study, quote, folk Hinduism even today. So this too represents a major change of the first couple centuries AD and the Vedic period, the emergence of popular devotional Hinduism. It's really at this time that we can say, okay, well, we at least have some of the general parameters of what we can call and recognize as Hinduism. Whereas what came before this was, properly speaking, Vedic Brahmanism, something different. And what came before that was something different still, a more primitive and more simplistic form of Vedic religion. All right, one final topic in the social sphere. The caste system also evolved in some notable ways during the Gupta period, and here the developments seem to be very much centered on the Gupta period. And we sense, or we see in the record, indications of fluidity and mobility and change within the caste system. So first, due to increased decentralization, land grants, economic and geographical expansion, entirely new groups on the subcontinent were acculturated into the caste system for the first time, including numerous tribal groups which had, hitherto, lived quite isolated and remote lives, unattached necessarily, at least in a direct sense, to political or social systems, to the caste system. And this, therefore, injects a degree of uncertainty or impetus for change into the caste system. There is evidence at this time for increased intermarriage between castes, and formal approvals, that is to say documents, of these types of marriages exist from the period. And the caste hierarchy itself undergoes some changes in how it's understood. Some castes seem to have improved their overall standing, that is to say, their collective standing. Others, of course, maintained their collective standing. The Brahmins remained atop the caste hierarchy at this time, due to their education, their training, their role in religious life, and so forth. However, the Kshatriya caste underwent, let's say, conceptual change. It is, in fact, the case that many of the ruling houses of the Gupta period did not actually come from the Kshatriya caste. And so the idea was put forward at this time that one could achieve status as a Kshatriya, not merely be born into it. A de facto acceptance of the reality of the situation of the ruling classes. The Vaishyas grew in influence collectively due to the explosion of jatis as a result of the expanding and flourishing economy. The Shudras themselves also increased in status, becoming not mere laborers, but, it seems, sharecroppers or even independent peasants with independent land holdings. Some, it's very clear, became craftsmen. Some joined the army. Some even received an education and came to be granted legal rights, which previously did not exist at all. All of this was counterbalanced by the growth of a new outcast group, notably the untouchables, who were assigned the most demeaning and filthy occupations, and who, along with slaves, constituted the lowest rung of India's social pyramid. A Chinese traveler of the Gupta period noted that the untouchables had to announce their presence in the streets with a clapper so other caste members would be warned of their presence. Upper caste individuals at this time who came too close to the untouchables tended to take ritual baths thereafter, and you will see very directly in one of the reading assignments for this unit of study how, in one particular region of India, here in the modern period, these two caste groups interact. So, some important changes on the social front too, pertaining to the caste system. All right, if you have questions about this lecture, please do get in touch.